Hello guys, welcome to another video, and another Forgotten Unique. This is a new series that I started recently on the channel, and it's all about exactly that, unique items which are barely used, if at all. Taking a look at the mechanics of these items and looking at any synergies or interesting use cases they may have, especially considering a lot of the more recent additions to the game in terms of ascendancy changes or new unique items. This video is all about Apep's Supremacy, a unique shield which is exclusive to Incursion League content. The shield must be created by upgrading Apep's Slumber using a Vial of Awakening at the Altar of Sacrifice in the Apex of Ascension, which is a tier 3 room in Alba's temple, that's the Temple of Azoatl. Apep's Slumber, the prerequisite unique shield, is dropped exclusively from the chest found in the Toxic Grove, which is another tier 3 room in that temple. Meanwhile, the other component, the Vial of Awakening, can drop from the end boss of the temple. So let's take a look at the modifiers on Apep's Supremacy. First, we have a flat added damage modifier, adds 50 to 55 to 72 to 80 chaos damage, and this is the equivalent to a level 9 or level 10 added chaos damage support depending on the role. Then there's a very large flat energy shield modifier, plus 130 to 150 maximum energy shield. With a good base energy shield roll and a good roll on this modifier with 30% quality, you can actually reach up to around 280 energy shield from Apep's Supremacy, which is quite good. Then there's also 30 to 50% faster start of energy shield recharge. And now we get to the special modifiers on this shield. You take chaos damage instead of physical damage from bleeding. So bleeding is a damaging ailment which deals physical damage over time, and it's generally considered to be the most dangerous damaging ailment in the game, at least from the perspective of a monster inflicting that ailment on the player. Bleeding deals 70% of the base damage of the hit which inflicted the ailment per second for 5 seconds, but the damage dealt is tripled to 210% per second while the target is moving. Many characters will opt to use the Ralakesh Pantheon to make bleeding a lot less dangerous because it prevents bleeding from dealing the extra damage to you while you're moving, and it actually turns the bleeding mechanic on its head, making it deal reduced damage to you while you're moving. Now, Apep's Supremacy will make you take chaos damage instead of physical damage from any instance of bleeding on you. The immediate synergy here is with Chaos Inoculation, keystone which sets your maximum life to 1 and makes you immune to chaos damage. By combining this keystone with Apep's Supremacy, you'll be able to effectively ignore bleeding. You can still be inflicted with bleeding, but it won't deal any damage to you. This means your minor Pantheon choice could be freed up, and if you can also solve Corrupted Blood, for example by taking the passive skill tree Protection Mastery, or by using a duel with a Corrupted Implicit so that Corrupted Blood cannot be inflicted on you, you can also forgo using any kind of bleed and CB removal flask, as you no longer need to worry about those mechanics. But the modifier on Apep's Supremacy isn't exclusively useful with just Chaos Inoculation. In fact, it's very strong to be just used on a standard setup with capped Chaos Resistance, because the large majority of builds won't have a lot of additional physical damage reduction to help mitigate the damage over time from bleeding. Let's compare this modifier on a character with capped Chaos Resistance to a character using the Soul of Ralakesh Pantheon power. The character using Apep's Supremacy would take the extra damage from bleeding while moving, so they take 210% of the inflicting hit damage per second while moving, and 70% per second while stationary. With 75% chaos resistance, they'd effectively be taking 52.5% of the inflicting hit damage per second while moving, and just 17.5% per second while stationary. Meanwhile, the character with the Soul of Ralakesh takes no extra damage from bleeding while moving, and they take 25% reduced damage from bleeding while moving, so they'd effectively be taking 52.5% of the inflicting hit damage per second while moving, and 70% per second while stationary. In this comparison, you can see that the character using Apep's Supremacy with capped Chaos Resistance takes the same damage from the bleed as the character using the Soul of Ralakesh while moving, but they take significantly less damage while stationary. Something important to note here, however, is that the Soul of Ralakesh Pantheon makes you take 25% reduced damage from all physical damage over time while moving, not just bleeding, so it's useful against other sources of physical damage over time as well. Something else which may be useful to know is that the modifier on Apep Supremacy, which makes you take chaos damage instead of physical damage from bleeding, is actually not a damage taken as modifier. The interaction happens prior to the calculation of damage taken as modifiers in the receiving damage calculation, which means that technically you can still shift this portion of damage into another damage type. For example, by using the Templar's Uber Flesh and Flame Duel exclusive, Searing Purity. Now, there is another potential use case for this modifier which makes use of another unique item, the Tainted Pact Amulet. However, before we discuss this synergy, we should first get to the other modifiers on Apep Supremacy. Plus 25% chance to be poisoned. This modifier will make all incoming hits of physical or chaos damage have a chance to inflict poison on you. Then, plus 3% to all maximum resistances while poisoned, and poisons on you expire 50% slower. The increased maximum resistance modifier will increase all resistances, including chaos resistance, as long as you're poisoned. Meanwhile, the poison expiry rate modifier will effectively double the duration of poisons that are inflicted on you by slowing the time in which it expires by 50%. This isn't the same as a poison or ailment duration modifier, and is technically a multiplier for poison duration, without actually increasing the duration of the poison. This modifier stacks additively with other sources of slower expiry rate effects, such as the one on temporal chains, up to the cap of 75% slower rate of expiry. Now, whilst Apep Supremacy provides a decent chance to be poisoned by incoming hits, you'd want a more reliable way to maintain poison on yourself so that you can always benefit from the maximum resistance modifier, which is where another item comes into play, the Golden Rule Unique Jewel. This jewel has some very interesting mechanics for use with Apep Supremacy. Firstly, the Golden Rule will reflect any poison that you inflict on enemies back to you as long as you have under 100 stacks of poison on you at the time. And it will also grant 1% chaos resistance per poison, which is potentially useful if you're lacking chaos resistance to reach the cap. Reflected ailments scale their duration based on offensive stats such as increased poison duration, and they're not affected by stats which increase or reduce the duration of ailments on you, such as reduced poison duration on you. However, the modifier for poison expiry rate on Apep Supremacy isn't an increase or reduction to the duration of poison on you. In fact, expiry rate modifiers won't modify the actual duration of an effect. Instead, they just change the rate of expiry, which means this modifier will slow the rate of expiry for any reflected poisons using the Golden Rule. By default then, poison duration is 2 seconds. And with this modifier taken into account, the actual amount of time a reflected poison will last on you is 4 seconds, assuming you have no other increases or reductions to poison duration. With this kind of setup, you could consider using the Temptation Step unique boots, which were only added to the core game last league in 3.23. These unique boots grant increased damage and movement speed per poison on you, up to 75% and 50% respectively. But the Golden Rule doesn't only reflect poison, it also reflects bleeding and grants an increase to armor while bleeding as well. So it's time we talked about an item mentioned earlier, Tainted Pact. This unique amulet makes chaos damage over time heal you instead while leeching life. Poison inherently deals chaos damage over time, while bleeding will also make you take chaos damage over time instead of physical damage thanks to Apep Supremacy. This combination of mechanics then will allow you to potentially self-inflict ailments which actually heal you instead of damaging you. Now the interesting thing about the Tainted Pact is that the heal gained from the chaos damage over time is actually based on post-mitigation damage. That is, the damage that you would have taken from the source of chaos damage over time after it's been reduced by things like chaos resistance, which creates an interesting balancing tightrope where you want your chaos resistance to be high enough that you won't immediately die to chaos hit damage, and low enough that you benefit from the healing from chaos damage over time. Some of you may be aware of Khan's Bone Shatter Slayer using the Tainted Pact from several leagues ago. If you're interested, I'll link his video in the description below. But that build uses the Tainted Pact with the Golden Rule to reflect incredibly deadly poisons onto yourself, which then heal you for ridiculous amounts of life per second. However, the Tainted Pact does have a very important prerequisite for the healing to work. You must be leeching life. Like any leech, Life Leech normally stops when unreserved life is filled, removing any existing leech instances. And this is why Khan's build is a Slayer, for the brutal further ascendancy notable, which makes it so that life leech effects are not removed when unreserved life is filled. If you're going to make use of the Tainted Pact, you'll need a way to maintain life leech, but Slayer isn't the only option. There's also the Ascendant Slayer notable, which grants the same modifier. Meanwhile, you can gain this effect from a few non-ascendancy mechanics as well. The Immortal Ambition Timeless Keystone will grant this modifier, but be aware that this keystone will make life leech recover energy shield instead while you're on full life. You can prevent this part of the keystone from working by reserving some of your life so that you can never reach full life. You could also use Petrified Blood and make sure you're not reserving 50% or more of your life, and that way life leech effects aren't removed at the maximum recoverable amount of 50% life. There's also the Offering to the Serpent. However, you probably don't want to use these unique gloves, as they'll also reduce your maximum recovery per life leech by 50%, which by default would lower the amount of life that can be leeched per instance to just 5%, resulting in a maximum leech instance duration of just 2.5 seconds. And this is bad, because when playing this kind of setup, you want to ensure that you're dealing enough hit damage to reach your leech cap per instance, and that the effective life leech duration exceeds the duration of reflected poisons, so that you never take chaos damage over time from those poisons. There's also the potential to use the golden rule to reflect a deadly bleed onto yourself and force that bleed to heal you using Apep Supremacy, combined with the Tainted Pact. Again, just be aware of the duration of bleeding compared to your life leech. Bleeding lasts for 5 seconds by default. Lastly, I'll mention Divine Flesh, as you may want to make use of this keystone with Apep Supremacy. I'd only really recommend using the Tainted Pact with Divine Flesh in this setup if you're intending to play a version that caps chaos resistance, as this keystone will make 50% of elemental damage be taken as chaos damage instead. And if you were going for a low amount of chaos resistance to ensure a lot of healing from the chaos damage over time, you'll inevitably just die to incoming elemental hits. But without the Tainted Pact, using this keystone with Apep Supremacy and focusing on scaling your chaos resistance and other means to mitigate chaos damage is a strong combination, as you'll already be wanting to reduce the damage you take from reflected poisons or incoming bleeds, and the shield already provides an additional 3% maximum chaos resistance while you're poisoned, helping you scale the effectiveness of Divine Flesh. Alright, so why isn't Apep Supremacy used more often? I'll be honest, I think this shield is incredibly underrated at the moment, but with that said, there's competition such as Sapphire's Frame, which provides an extra 1% maximum resistance compared to Apep Supremacy, and doesn't require a prerequisite such as being poisoned. In fact, the prerequisite of needing to be poisoned is the biggest drawback for this shield, as it requires the use of investment elsewhere such as the Golden Rule to actually make it work, while simply making it less reliable of a defensive mechanic. For that reason, it makes sense to really lean into that mechanic if you're using the shield, making use of other synergistic mechanics at the same time like Temptation Step or Tainted Pact. Thank you to my patrons for your ongoing support of this channel, I really appreciate it. If you've been enjoying the stuff I make here on YouTube, consider becoming a patron and supporting me and my channel going forward. All of the information can be found by following the link in the description below. Thanks for watching this video, and I'll see you in the next one.